Hey VC, how's it going? Right, okay, something a little bit different. So a few days ago, I picked this record up. This is an album by Ananda Shankar. So Ananda Shankar, obviously nephew of Ravi Shankar, Indian classical musician. And it just got me thinking about just the use of sitar in Western pop music. And I'll come back to this record in a minute, but what I've done is picked out a few albums which feature the sitar, and all of them had that sort of East meets West sound, and that sort of dynamic, and I find it interesting. So some of them work better than others, but I'm going to start off by showing this. This is Ananda Shankar's debut record, I think from 1970. And now this record has quite an interesting backstory, because from what I understand, from what I remember anyway, somebody will correct me if I'm wrong, but Jimi Hendrix asked to make a record with Ananda Shankar, and Ananda Shankar turned him down. And I think the reason for that was that he wanted to go away and make his own record. He had his own ideas around incorporating Western pop music into his Indian classical sound. And the product of that was this. So yeah, now it's quite dated. So it's very much of its time. Some of it is excellent, but some of it is a little bit cheesy. And for example, the first side includes two cover versions. It opens with a version of Jumping Jack Flash, obviously a Stones tune, and there's also a version of The Doors' Light My Fire. Now, both of these come across almost a little bit novelty, like novelty records. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing, because the reason why I bought this record was because back in the 90s, I remember being in a club in Birmingham, and you know, there had two rooms. One room was sort of modern indie music, the other room was sort of classic 60s mod stuff. And I remember the DJ playing the version of Jumping Jack Flash, and it went down a treat, and I loved it. And after hearing it, I wanted to get a copy of it. It took me years to find a copy, but that basically introduced me to this album and into the music, you know, in general, of Ananda Shankar. So I'll perhaps do a needle drop on that, but yeah, the rest of the record I think works a little bit better. It includes a lot of Moog on here, a lot of electronics. So, you know, again, he's obviously quite forward thinking for the time, but it certainly does place the music from that sort of period. But yeah, a really good record. I think the highlights are there's a straight sort of Indian classical piece called The Ocean, which goes on for about 13 minutes. Absolutely fantastic. But there's also a track on here called Snowflower. If you know, get yourself on YouTube and check it out. I think that's the track on here where that East meets West sound works best. But yeah, I'll do a needle drop on Jumping Jack Flash. Okay, so then you get into I'll come back to the 60s, but obviously in the 90s with Britpop and everything, of course, that sort of late 60s psychedelic sound with the use of Indian instrumentation, you know, influenced the 90s bands as well. So you had the likes of Cooler Shaker, they had that big album that they came with Tatvar and Govind, all that sort of stuff, which I did quite like at the time actually. But I think this is perhaps the most interesting record from that sort of period. And this is Corner Shop. Now, Corner Shop are from Wolverhampton. Obviously, their family, they're British, but their family has Indian heritage. And they actually do a version of Norwegian Wood on this record, but they sing it in Punjabi. And you know, again, it has a little bit of a novelty quality to it, but it certainly sort of turns the song on its head a little bit. Obviously, George Harrison added the sitar sound to the original, and I don't think he was necessarily the first musician, the first British or American Western musician to include a sitar on a pop hit. I think there were other bands that did it before him, but certainly I'd say that's perhaps the most famous example. So Corner Shop covering covering Norwegian Wood, I think is a really nice touch, and it's how this record closes. So yeah, I'll do a needle drop on that. Right, so next up, this is a record that goes back to 1968. This is an album by Lord Sitar. Now, I think there's a bit of a sort of a fuss when this came out, because it's predominantly an album of cover versions of songs from the time, stuff like I'm the Walrus, Eleanor Rigby, Blue Jay Way, obviously all done by the Beatles, but stuff like Daydream Believer, Black is Black, all done obviously on the sitar. Now, I think at the time people thought this was George Harrison. It's not. It's Big Jim Sullivan, who was a session musician for the time. He played on loads of great 60s tunes, loads of great hits into the 1970s, like the Walker Brothers, Georgie Fame. He played with a number of different musicians. But yeah, so I remember being in London 1997. I can remember while I was there, I was going down to the Royal Albert Hall to see the Manic Street Preachers, and I went into Kensington Market, and there was a little record store there, and they were playing a sitar version of I Can See for Miles by The Who. Now, I wanted to know what it was. I thought it was fantastic. Obviously, it's got that novelty element to it, but a week before that, I'd been in Birmingham, and I'd been to a record shop, and there's a piece of music playing, and I went to the counter, and I asked the guy behind the counter what the music was, and he told me what it was. So I said, oh yeah, I'll have a copy of that, please. And I was horrified when he turned round and pressed stop on the CD player. Obviously, this is the time of CDs. Stop the CD player, pulled the CD out, stopped the music. The shop was full. Everybody's turning around to see why the music has stopped. And he didn't put another song on until he finished serving me. I was just dying inside, you know, I was only a young lad. So when I heard I Can See for Miles being played in Kensington Market, I didn't have the balls to ask the guy who owned the shop who sang it. So it took me years and years to work out that it's from this album by Lord Sitar. Now, again, it's a little bit cheesy. It is, but it's it's a nice novelty thing, you know. Not the sort of album that you're going to listen to again and again, but definitely worth a listen. And finally, I'm just going to go back to this record, this album by Ananda Shankar. Now, interestingly, this is from 1981. So that's 11 years after his debut came out. And it's just interesting the fact that he's still trying to incorporate elements of Western pop music into his Indian classical sound. And there's a lovely track on here, which I'll do a needle drop on, which has a real funk to it. You can hear those funky drums with the Indian instrumentation going on over the top of it. I think it's a lovely moment, and one that I'll do a nil drop on. So there you go. That's 4 or 5 records, which are all sort of Western pop songs, incorporating a little bit of sitar. So cheers.